This is a presentation of the University of Wisconsin-Parkside.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jerry Coyne from the University of Chicago Department of Ecology and Evolution, who will be giving the penultimate talk in our Darwin 1809, 1859, 2009 series. Jerry got his bachelor's degree at the College of William and Mary, then went on to get a PhD at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard with population geneticist Lewontin, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship with Tim Prout at the University of California, Davis. It was during this time that I actually first met him when I was an undergraduate, and he was out looking for jobs. And unfortunately for me, he didn't get the job at my university. Otherwise, I might know him even better. But he then went on to the University of Maryland, and then eventually wound up at the University of Chicago, where he's been for quite a few years now. His research interests are primarily in the origin of species, literally, not just evolution in general, but the specific problem, which Darwin actually only made very modest progress towards solving. That is, how do new reproductively isolated populations come into existence? How do things like gray squirrels and fox squirrels come to be? Although he's worked not mostly in squirrels but flies. More recently, he has just published this year, connected with the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth, a new book entitled Why Evolution is True, a book intended for a general audience, and he will speak to us on that topic tonight. Jerry.
Thanks. Thanks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I'm suffering from a bit of bronchitis, so I may evolve into a horse towards the end of this talk. I just had a question for Greg. It is the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th of the publication of The Origin. I just noticed Greg is speaking on November 11th. Isn't that the day that The Origin...
It's November 24th.
Oh, 24th. Okay, my mistake. Anyway... So it shows my ignorance. I usually don't like to travel and give seminars because I work in the lab a lot, even to a place as close as Parkside, University of Wisconsin-Parkside. But Greg knows that my motto is, we'll speak for food. So he promised me that if I came, I could have lunch at Cupid Burgers, which of course I know very well, and that I could have a Kringle for breakfast tomorrow. So I've had my lunch, and Greg promises that there's a Kringle in the fridge at his house. So if I do a good job tonight, I may be able to get that. Anyway, thanks for turning it out. My talk is largely about the topic of my book, but I want to throw in some other stuff as well. If you do want to learn more about what the evidence for evolution is and why it's important, you can pick up a copy of the book, or you can wait till January 22nd of next year when it goes into paperback and save yourself some money. Okay. So I want to start with a hypothetical example, just to demonstrate the seriousness of the problem of the ignorance about evolution in our country. And this is a hypothetical example. As I said, it's a made-up graph. Let's assume that this is a graph representing the acceptance of 34 technologically advanced countries. These are real countries, listed from Iceland to Turkey on the left side, and their acceptance of the germ theory of disease. That is, the theory that many infectious diseases like strep throat and syphilis and malaria are caused by small, invisible microorganisms. And then we plot on each of those countries how many people accept that theory, and that's the length of the blue bar going from 0 to 100%. Acceptance is these blues, don't knows are the yellows, and reds are don't accept, that deny the germ theory of disease. Now, if you saw a graph like this, particularly one that had the United States down in position number 33 out of 34, just above Turkey, you'd probably be appalled, because you'd see that only 40 to 45% of Americans accept the germ theory of disease, which is crazy. We all know that a lot of infectious diseases, in fact, all of them, are caused by microorganisms ranging from viruses to protozoans. So if this was a real graph, not a hypothetical one, you'd be pretty appalled. You'd say, well, the United States is a technologically sophisticated nation. We're scientifically, supposedly the most advanced country in the world. Why are we down there at the bottom, sandwiched between Cyprus and Turkey? Okay, so fortunately this is hypothetical, but I can make this into a real graph simply by changing a couple of words in the title, and then it becomes real. And it was published 2 years ago, or actually 3 years ago in Science. This is a graph of the proportion of people in these different countries that accept the theory of evolution. And now these bars are accurate. They absolutely represent the people in each country that accept that. And as you can see, the United States is down here in position 33 out of 34, with 46% of Americans accepting evolution, just above the 30-odd% in Turkey. But look at all the other countries. Iceland is up there with 85, 90%. Denmark, Sweden, France, Japan, the UK, they're all beating us. So why are things so bad in the United States? I mean, scientifically, it's reprehensible that this is the situation, because the theory of evolution, as I'll try to convince you tonight, is supported by just as much evidence as the germ theory of disease, even though they're both called theories. So why are we so poor in this situation? I'll talk about that at the end of the lecture after I give you the evidence for evolution. Okay? And if you think you're any better in Wisconsin than the rest of the country, you're wrong. I don't know if you can see this, but these are grades that were given to the various states in terms of their high school and public school treatment of evolutionary biology in public school science classrooms, and it goes from A to F. You can see Florida gets an A, Indiana gets an A, Illinois gets a B, and Wisconsin gets a D. Okay? This was just published 2 weeks ago in the Evolution Education Outreach. And if you want to know why Wisconsin is so bad in this respect, you can actually read this journal online and find out the reasons why Wisconsin gets such a D. But notice how much worse off you are than your neighbors, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, and Iowa. Okay. I don't actually know the reasons for this, but it means there's something wrong. Okay. All right. One thing I'm not going to talk about tonight is the opposition to evolution, which is one of the reasons why evolution is so poorly received in this country, because you have a loud and vociferous anti-evolution lobby, most of them biblical creationists, that oppose it. I'm not going to talk about that much, except to say that creationism has constantly been there, nipping at our heels throughout the history of evolutionary biology, and it is engaged in a series of courtroom battles with us, beginning in 1925, the famous Scopes monkey trial, which evolution lost, by the way. This is Clarence Darrow arguing in the courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee. And since then, every time intelligent design has come up in court, or creationism, it's been knocked down. So since 1925, there's been a series of court victories for evolution and science education. But every time we win, creationism comes back in a different guise. First, as straight creationism, which is what won in Dayton, so-called creation science, the view that the tenets of the Bible, like the Great Flood and instantaneous creation, are scientifically verifiable. And then, since that was knocked down, it's come back as intelligent design. And I won't really talk much about that, except that 5 years ago in Dover, Pennsylvania, intelligent design was also knocked out of contention as something that should be taught in the science classroom. So we've had a series of victories in public schools about evolution being what you need to teach your kids, because it's right. But that doesn't mean that Americans accept evolution. There are far more Americans that actually deny the theory of evolution than embrace it wholeheartedly. And that's a shameful situation. Okay, and it's one that I tried to remedy in my book. I wrote this book, it came out in January of this year, because I thought that presenting the evidence for evolution, which is huge, it's multifarious, it's a mountain of evidence, so mountainous that it should just crush literally any opposition like a bug. I was hoping that by putting all this evidence between two covers in a smallish book, that people would be convinced. They'd come over to the side of Darwinism. I'm not so sanguine about that anymore, because I'm not so sure that presenting the evidence for evolution is the way to win in the courtroom of public opinion. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this talk. But anyway, I'm going to try this evening. Many of you already accept the theory of evolution. Maybe you don't know why it's true. Maybe you just are going on authority. I'll try to tell you tonight why it is true. And many of you maybe are on the fence or are unconvinced, or maybe even opponents of evolution. And I hope that I'll show you that it qualifies not only as a valid scientific theory, but as a scientific truth. So in order to tell you why evolution is true, I have to do a couple of things. First of all, I have to tell you, since it's the theory of evolution, just like the germ theory of disease, what we mean by scientific theory. Okay? Then I have to tell you what we mean by saying a scientific theory is true. What do we mean by something is true in science? I have to tell you what evolution is, what the theory is. It's not so simple. It's actually made up of 5 or 6 distinct parts. And then I have to tell you what the evidence for evolution is. And in the end, try to convince you that all that evidence mounts up to what we define in science as a theory that has been proved to be true. Okay? I'm doing this in the hopes that those of you who don't accept evolution will come over to the light side, but also that those of you who do accept it but aren't sure what the evidence is, maybe because you want to argue your case against those who disbelieve it, will have an armamentarium of evidence to support you. Okay? First thing I want to talk about, and very briefly, is what we mean by a scientific theory. I guess I have to stick pretty close to the microphone. Because evolution is often dismissed as only a theory. This is probably the most common way that Americans dispose of evolution in their mind. I was just in Alabama last week, for example, where in their public school textbooks, biology textbooks, they are forced by law to put a sticker that says, evolution is only a theory. And it is not, there's evidence that doesn't quite support it, and you should think critically about it. Okay? And they think that's okay. Of course, you don't see stickers in physics textbooks that say that atoms are only a theory, and we should think critically about whether atoms really exist. Shows you there's something unique about evolution that doesn't apply to other sciences. Of course, what that is that evolution strikes deeply at the heart of our self-image and of our views about how we came to be. Okay? That's a digression, but what I want to do first is to tell you what a scientific theory is. Okay? First of all, it is not what most people think about when you say you have a theory. Like my theory is that Joe is having an affair with Sue. Okay, that's a simple guess or a hypothesis or a speculation. But that's not what we mean by a scientific theory, although that's what the layperson means by scientific theory. That's what Ronald Reagan meant in 1980 when he was running for president, and he dismissed evolution as saying, well, it's a theory, it's a scientific theory only. There's the only. And in recent years, it has been challenged in the world of science, not believed as much as it once was. Okay, in this view, and in Reagan's view, a theory is a speculation, an idle guess, a hypothesis. Okay. But that's not what we scientists think of when we're talking about a theory in the sense of the theory of gravity, the theory of atoms, or the germ theory of disease. And by the way, a doctor just told me yesterday that they still call it the germ theory of disease, okay, even though it's a fact. Okay? A scientific theory is not a speculation or a guess. It is a convincing explanatory framework for a body of evidence about the real world. Okay? It's not just a guess. It's a well-thought-out theory meant to explain statements about the real world. A good theory will make sense of wide-ranging data, like the germ theory of disease. Why do you get sick when somebody else near you is sick? That was previously unexplained. Okay? And finally, a good scientific theory will make testable predictions and be vulnerable to falsification. A good scientific theory is one which you can conceivably prove wrong by making observations. You could prove the germ theory of disease wrong, or you could prove the theory of atoms wrong by making various observations about the world. They haven't been proven wrong, but a good theory is of that nature. You have to be able to show it to be wrong. Okay? Now, what I want to convince you tonight is the theory of evolution is a theory in the sense I've just described. It is a well-thought-out explanation for a number of observations about nature, and it's a set of propositions that also makes predictions about what we're going to find in nature when we haven't yet examined it, and those predictions are met. What I want to convince you is that when a theory becomes supported by so many observations that it becomes dumb to say, well, it doesn't hold, then it becomes a scientific fact. Okay? A scientific fact, and this is my own personal definition about what we mean when something is a truth or a fact, is an assertion for which there is so much evidence that it would be perverse to deny it. Okay? In other words, so many people accept the evidence, the empirical evidence for the theory, that those people that don't, there's got to be something wrong with. Okay? I mean, and one of the facts that you're going to do says that here's a table, right? Everybody sees this table. There's evidence for it. Anybody in this audience who says, well, there's no table there, you'd think, well, there's something wrong with them, okay? And what I try to convince you is there is as much evidence for evolution as there is for the existence of this table. It is a scientific fact. It is a fact because there's so much evidence supporting evolution, and I can run through it only very briefly tonight, that it would be perverse to deny it. And in fact, those who do deny it always have external reasons or other reasons for denying, usually based on some religious considerations. Okay? So here's theories that have become facts. The theory of atoms. Everybody knows that atoms exist now. We actually can see them using tunneling electron microscopes. Foolish and perverse to deny they exist. Disease-causing bacteria. I suppose there may be a few people out there that don't believe that germs cause infectious disease, but they're perverse. Okay? Germ theory is a fact. And the theory of evolution, as I say endlessly, has so much evidence supporting it as a fact. It's the theory of evolution, which was a hypothesis, and a largely unsupported theory right when Darwin was beginning to think about it in the 1850s, has now accumulated so much evidence that it's graduated to the status of facthood. Okay, so I hope you know what a theory is, and I hope you know that theories and facts are not so different from one another. A theory that becomes so well supported as a fact, I already told you when it attains facthood. Okay. Now, what is the theory of evolution? Okay, what is the theory that Darwin proposed and has been polished since the 1850s by many generations of scientists that I'm going to tell you is true in this lecture? And it's actually more than one thing. The theory of evolution consists of at least 5 parts, each of which can be tested separately and distinctly, and each of which has passed those tests repeatedly, meaning that the whole theory, which is a composite theory of several distinct assertions, is extremely strong. It's been repeatedly supported in all its parts, and it's self-reinforcing. I've divided it up in 5 parts, and here's what I call the theory of evolution that we're testing tonight. First of all, the idea that evolution in itself happens. That is, there is genetic change in populations over time. Populations of organisms do not remain static over the history of life, but change. That's evolution. But that's only part of the theory of evolution. There's also the proposition that it usually happens fairly slowly. That is, evolution is not instantaneous. A population of lizards does not become a population of birds in one generation. It usually takes thousands to hundreds of thousands of millions of years for evolutionary change to happen gradually. Although there is some change that is more rapid. Okay, so that's the second part. And these are somewhat independent. You could have evolution, but it doesn't have to happen gradually. It could happen overnight, right? So you have to test both of these separately. There's also the idea that Greg talked about, the idea of speciation, that one single lineage of plants or animals will, over time, divide into 2 or more lineages. So we have lineage A turning into lineage B and C here. This is the way that, starting with a single primordial form of life 3.4 billion years ago, we have arrived at the 10 to 20 million species, or 50 million perhaps, that inhabit the Earth today. Another proposition. Okay, it's separate from the first 2. You can have evolution, you can have gradualism, but you don't have to have splitting. If that were true, you'd, of course, only have one species on Earth, but that's not true. Anyway, we need to look at evidence for that as well. The reverse side of the idea of speciation is the idea of common ancestry. So, if you have 2 species, A and B, that are a result of a split and a common ancestor, you should be able to trace those species back in the fossil record or through other methods like molecular biology and find a common ancestor. The theory of evolution absolutely predicts that any pair of species, no matter how distantly removed in appearance, like humans and ferns, humans and corn, humans and frogs, have a common ancestor that lived sometime in the past. This is merely the reverse side of speciation, but looking backwards instead of forwards. This is a very powerful prediction of evolution, that any pair of species has a common ancestor, and you should be able to find evidence for that. Okay? So that's proposition 4. It's more or less the reverse side of the coin of proposition 3. And of course, this is what gives rise to the branching bush of life. This is just one part of that branching bush. It's the family tree of part of the primates. And you can see we're closely related to chimpanzees, a little less to gorillas, a little less to orangs, and so on, etc. Okay. And finally, the last part of the theory that I want to tell you is that much of the evolutionary change was caused by a process suggested by Darwin called natural selection, often thought of as survival of the fittest. Okay. It is, as far as we know, the only process that is responsible for producing the remarkable design of animals and plants. The fact that cheetahs are adapted to catch gazelles. The fact that flatfish are camouflaged when they lay on the bottom of the ocean. All of these remarkable fits between animals and their environment are the result of the process of natural selection. It is not the only process that produces evolution, but it's the only process, as far as we know, that produces adaptation. And again, this is a separable assertion from the first four. You can have evolution, you can have gradualism, you can have common ancestry and speciation, but it doesn't have to be natural selection that caused all that. It could be something else, okay? So each of these propositions can be tested separately, okay? So what I'm going to do for the rest of this lecture is to tell you how they've been tested and why they're all true, okay? Like any good scientific theory, the theory of evolution makes predictions. Predictions that can be tested by going out into the real world and seeing if what you predict is actually met. Here's the simplest one. We think that life originated as a single form of life, originated only once in the distant past. We think now it's about 3.4 billion years ago. We think that there is only a single ancestral creature because all of us have certain features in common, like the genetic code that is carried in our DNA. How that code produces proteins is identical in every organism on Earth, which implies that life originated only once, and we've inherited that kind of coding mechanism. Okay? So if that's what happened, we should see that the first detectable traces of life on Earth would be fairly simple, because life originated from organic molecules that themselves were not living, and that over time, as you go further and further towards more recent times in the fossil record, you should see more and more complex life. You should still see simple life, because after all, bacteria were there 3 billion years ago and they're still with us. But you should also see more complex forms of life forming. Okay. Now, this is a slice of the fossil record, the geological record as we call it, with the ages, both relative and absolute in terms of millions of years over here, and the biological events that we see happening at each stage of the fossil record. Each stage of the geological stratum, and you can see it absolutely conforms to what the theory of evolution predicts. These relative datings were known to biologists before Darwin's time, but nobody had sort of looked at the fossils in them to see if there was any discernible progression or change over time that could correspond to any kind of theory of evolution. Well, now we know that there is. So what Darwin predicted, and Darwin did not have a good fossil record in his time. He says very, very little about fossils and the origin of species, simply because they didn't have many fossils at the time. But since then, people have been digging in the Earth's crust assiduously, and they've confirmed that prediction. The earliest life is found 3.4 billion years ago, more or less as predicted. It's blue-green algae, also called cyanobacteria, because they're really bacteria. They first appear, and this is the first creature that we can unambiguously identify as life. It's a stromatolite. It's an accretion of blue-green algae that's been fossilized 3.4 billion years ago. And then as you go towards more recent times, you see early shell animals, but you see invertebrates until you get to about 500 million years ago. Then you see fish. Later on, you see amphibians. Of course, all these earlier forms remain with us, but more complex things appear. Dinosaurs, and then eventually mammals and humans. Not to say that humans are the culmination of the evolutionary process. We're just one of the latest appearing creatures in the evolutionary process. So here's a prediction that could be divined from Darwin's book in 1859, and which has been verified since then. Here's another prediction. If evolution occurs within lineages, and those lineages split and speciate, then we should be able to find examples of that in the fossil record. Not just this progression from simple organisms with the appearance of more complex ones later, but we should actually be able, if we had a good enough fossil record, to follow a lineage through time and see it changing. And, if we're lucky, see it splitting maybe into two lineages. Okay? And what I'm going to tell you is, and I don't have time to go into the hundreds and hundreds of examples where this is true, that we see this over and over again. Here's a very simple example in a one-celled marine organism. We have a great fossil record of marine organisms because when they die, they sink right to the bottom of the ocean. They're covered with sediment and preserved and fossilized. So you can take cores through the ocean floor and trace lineages of these single-celled organisms. This one is a diatom. And this is an example of a trace through the fossil record of about 2 million years. This is the age of the strata at which the sample is taken. So that's a 3 million-year-old sample, a 1 million-year-old sample. And you see, if you can take a single lineage, say this black one here, and follow it through time, and lo and behold, you see it changing. Sometimes it gets bigger, sometimes it gets smaller. That doesn't matter. What you're seeing is evolutionary change. Here's another lineage which actually changes fairly unidirectionally. Starts off here and then gets smaller and then remains static after that. So this is evolution in the fossil record. And it's particularly well documented in these microorganisms because they live in an area where fossilization is easy. You have to be, in order to be formed into a fossil, you have to die and land in the water and be covered by sediments. That's why we have such a great fossil record of these guys and such a poor fossil record of, say, humans, for example. Most humans don't fall in the water when they die. That included our ancestors. But more important here, you can see that we actually see the splitting event, where you have this ancestral lineage going along for about 500,000 years, and all of a sudden we see two descendant lineages splitting from it. Okay? One of them goes this way, one of them goes the other way. One of them gets bigger. By the way, this characteristic is an index of how big they are. So one of them gets bigger and the other one gets smaller. It's thought that maybe they were competing for food, so they diverged in body size. But regardless, we don't know why this happened. It happened 3 million years ago, but we see that it did. So we can confirm in this graph alone evolution and speciation. If you don't like microorganisms because you can't see them, they're not charismatic enough, well, here's a more charismatic mega-organism, which is the horse. We happen to have a very good fossil record of horses. They evolved largely in North America, although they subsequently went extinct and were reintroduced. And they were well fossilized, and we can trace the fossil record of horses all the way from this ancestral, sort of very small, five-toed Hyracotherium, used to be called Eohippus. And gradually over time, we see it branching, speciating, but also changing in general in many ways. Many lineages of horses, for example, got bigger and bigger and bigger. They lost their 5 toes and wound up with a single toe, which is what they walk on today, their hoof. It's the remnant of the middle toe. They got bigger, their teeth got larger, called hypsodonty, to deal with grasses. And again, this is just one of, say, 300 or 400 examples of where we can see not only evolutionary change in the fossils, as predicted, but also the throwing off of different branches. One of the great new findings about speciation is in our own family tree, the hominin family tree, where we now know that there is probably as many as 3 or 4 species of humans living together at the same time in Africa. Okay, here's another prediction. This is different from the last one. It's a prediction on common ancestry. If all creatures share common ancestry, then we should be able, if we trace the fossils back in time enough, be able to find those common ancestors. Okay? So-called missing links between major groups. Okay, one of the, sorry, I'm going to have to apologize for this throat problem, but bear with me. Scientists, before we had a fossil record, thought, and Huxley, who was Darwin's contemporary, hypothesized this, that because of certain similarities in the morphology, bone structure, and physiology of reptiles and birds, that birds probably descended from reptiles. That was the prediction. Okay. The test is, can we find anything in the fossil record that looks like a missing link between birds and reptiles? This wasn't known in Darwin's time. We did have Archaeopteryx, the famous fossil, but nobody really recognized what it was at that time. Well, let me go back. To find this one ancestral species, which is probably an early reptile called an archaeosaur, which is not recognizable as anything that would ever evolve into birds, is a very difficult proposition because this is a single species. And finding a single species in a very patchy fossil record, a record so patchy that we know only anywhere between 1/100th of 1% to 1% of the species that ever lived. So our maximum knowledge of the history of life is only 1%. To actually be expected to find this single species is too much. What we do expect to find is creatures that were on the road to becoming modern birds from ancestral reptiles, things along this path that maybe had some reptilian traits but had some later bird-like traits as well. These would also qualify as missing links. They're not exactly the common ancestor, but you predict that if there was such a common ancestor, you would see it evolving in a bird-like direction, but nevertheless still retaining some lizard-like characters. And in fact, it was predicted that birds evolved from a group of dinosaurs called theropods, which are light-bodied dinosaurs, carnivores. T-Rex is one of them. Okay? Wasn't known until, in fact, the past 30 or 40 years that these things actually existed. And here's one of them. this is Sinornithosaurus millenii. It looks very much like a theropod dinosaur. It has separate hand bones. If you look at a chicken, the fingers are fused together. They're not separate. This thing has teeth. If you look closely here, birds don't have teeth. Dinosaurs do. And look at this long bony tail, which is absolutely characteristic of a theropod dinosaur. Many of these fossils, which were not preserved well enough to be able to see what I'm going to point out in a minute, were thought, in fact, to be dinosaur fossils and misclassified. The thing about this one, which was discovered about 10 years ago in China in very fine sediments, is that it has feathers. Okay? It's basically a dinosaur that has feathers. Here they are. I've animated them a bit for your amusement. You can see the feathers here, feather impressions up there. They're usually not preserved because you need really good conditions of preservation to see these feathers. Here's some down here. This is a feathered dinosaur. Okay? It couldn't fly. It probably looked somewhat like that. In fact, T-Rex might have looked somewhat like that. When you see T-Rex in the museums, it's not covered with fluff. Okay, but it probably looked like a giant dinosaur that had a pillowcase shaken out on it. So, but they won't reconstruct it like that. But this one, Sinornithosaurus, probably looked like this. Okay, what better intermediate can you have between a bird and an ancestral dinosaur than an ancestral dinosaur that had feathers and some additional bird-like traits? Not only that, but there's more. It appears exactly at the right time in the fossil record where you expect it to be, 125 million years ago. That is well after the dinosaurs had already been in existence, but before we see any modern birds. So it's exactly where you expect to see a common ancestor, or at least a transitional form between birds and reptiles. After we see the dinosaurs, supposed ancestors, but before we have modern birds. And we've now dug up lots and lots of these things. There's no doubt that modern birds now descended from a dinosaur that got feathers, probably had feathers not to fly, but for thermoregulatory purposes, or maybe even displays. And then, from reasons that we're not completely sure of, those feathered dinosaurs eventually developed the ability to glide and then to fly. Okay, we don't know the selective pressures involved in this, but what we do know, without a doubt, is that birds are feathered dinosaurs. In fact, some scientists classify birds as dinosaurs today because they come out of the dinosaur group. Okay. Now, these common ancestors are very charismatic. A lot of people will look at a diatom lineage and see it changed and say, okay, blah, 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 it's evolution, yeah, right. Show me a common ancestor. Okay, I just did one. Now, here's some more charismatic organisms that have been predicted to have common ancestors and then subsequently found to have them in the last 20 years, and these are the whales. It was hypothesized, again, from certain structures of the whales. They are mammals, after all. They have hair and milk, and they're air breathers, but also certain aspects of their physiology and bone structure led biologists to think that they were descendants from what we call artiodactyls. These are even-toed animals that have pairs of toes, okay, 2 cloven hooves, for example, like the hippo. Okay, so that was the hypothesis, but we didn't have any fossils showing this. Now, if whales came back to the sea, secondarily aquatic animals, descended from something that was like a land animal, perhaps like a hippo. Hippos are actually semi-aquatic, but they do live on the land. Then we should be able to find the intermediates. And thanks to a lot of paleontological work, mostly in the Middle East, we now have those. There's one of them called Rhodocetus. It was an animal that probably spent part of its time in the water and part of its time on land. It's the skeleton. You can see it's developing flippers instead of hind limbs. Its hind limbs are changing. Its nostrils are moving up to the top of its head to form blowholes. Its ears are changing to be able to swim underwater. And in fact, now, if you dig back in the fossil record, we have a whole series of ancestors, starting with land animals, sort of like little deer. And then you can see them as you go furthermore in time, losing their hind limbs, transforming their forelimbs into flippers, hind limbs going away, nostrils moving up, becoming sleeker, developing tails, finally modern whales. All this documented in the fossil record. All this action took place over 10 million years, which seems like a long time, but it's actually not. It's very quick. To turn something like a deer into a whale in 10 million years, we evolved from a chimpanzee. It took about 7 million years for that. This is far more evolutionary change than that. Okay, but regardless of that, the fact is, it's well documented in the fossil record, and it confirms the prediction that whales are simply land animals that came back to the ocean and lost their flippers. Okay. And that they evolved from animals that were related to hippos, artiodactyls. In the last 2 years, we've actually found something that looks very much like the common ancestor of all whales. It's called Indohyus. It's very similar to the water chevrotain of Southeast Asia. If you go to Google and Google chevrotain, you'll see one of these deer-like creatures diving into the water and swimming under it for like a minute. So it's predicted that. And we actually have a fossil now that looks very much like the kind of thing that could have evolved into a whale. So we have more confirmation of the theory of evolution. Excuse me. And, of course, one of the greatest confirmations of the theory of evolution is the idea, which Darwin suggested in his book in 1859 with the one sentence, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. And sure enough, it has been. Darwin posited that humans originated from African apes, and sure enough, that's what we did. We now have a pretty good fossil record of a number of fossils, many of whom might have lived at the same times. What we have in the human fossil record is a number of dots, sporadic fossils that occur distant in time. We're not sure exactly who is ancestral to who here. That's why we have these dots. But what we do see is early human forms that look very ape-like, small brains, not quite fully bipedal, a little bit bent over, and then developing more and more modern human characteristics over time. Bigger brains, smaller teeth, reduced brow ridges, bipedality, etc. Okay. So that's what I call, those are all predictions of the theory of evolution. As I said, a good scientific theory not only makes predictions, but also explains things that were previously puzzling. And when it does that, I call these retrodictions. That is, you can see something that you couldn't quite predict, but you can see a phenomenon that makes sense only under the theory that you're talking about. And for evolution, there are certain puzzling observations from several areas which make sense only under the idea that organisms evolved and had common ancestors. Here's one of them. A lot of them come from the area of embryology or development. This is a spotted dolphin embryo at the age of 24 days. It looks very much like a human embryo. All early mammalian embryos look pretty fish-like. That, by the way, is one clue that we all have common fishy ancestors. But if you look at this spotted dolphin embryo, you notice a striking thing. It has these forelimb buds. This thing is going to develop into the front flippers. And all early tetrapod, or four-footed animal embryos, have these forelimb buds, which develop into, we have them too. They look just like this in our embryos, and they develop into our arms. But also it has the hind limb buds, which we also have, and all four-footed animals have. These things in us and vertebrates that walk on four legs develop into the hind legs. Now, spotted dolphins don't have hind legs. They're born with only front flippers and no legs. So why do they begin developing hind legs? Okay, they have these hind limb buds. And if you follow the development of this spotted dolphin embryo, what you see is something very curious. In 48 days, those hind limb buds start disappearing, and they go away. And in another 12 days, they're gone. Now, the question is, why do these dolphins, who don't have hind limbs, begin development exactly as every other vertebrate that does have hind limbs, forming the precursors of the hind limbs, and then getting rid of them? The only possible explanation, and the only one that makes sense, is, well, maybe they evolved from something that had four legs, and they got rid of the hind pair of legs simply by aborting a certain step in embryogenesis. Okay? This is one of these observations that makes sense only in light of evolution. Otherwise, you have to do intellectual gyrations like it pleased the creator to make dolphins look as though they were going to get hind limbs, but then it also pleased the creator to take them away. Maybe he was in a sort of jocular mood or performing some kind of vanishing act. And that's a kind of theology that is not very amiable to people. Okay. Now, sometimes those hind limb buds actually continue to develop. They're not aborted. Here's an example of a dolphin. This is not a spotted dolphin. I'm not sure which kind of dolphin it is. But anyway, you can see that these hind limb buds have continued to grow, forming things that look very much like legs or rear buds. And if you x-ray these things, you'll see they have bones in them that look very much like the rear leg bones of a four-footed animal. This is an enlargement of these things. Remember, these are not usually there, but sometimes they are. Why do they appear? Exactly where they should appear if they were going to be legs, containing exactly the same bones that they would if they were legs. Evolution. Dolphins, like whales, evolved from animals that had four legs, and they simply aborted the hind pair. Okay, there's the legs. We carry in our own embryology traces of our ancestry. Okay? This is another retrodiction. It's not something you can predict, it's something that can only be understood in evolution. Every one of us at the age of 6 months was covered with a thick coat of hair called the lanugo. If you're born prematurely, say around 6 months of age, you'll see that coat of hair. Here's an example. This is a baby. You can see it's quite fuzzy here. Now, that coat of hair is usually shed before birth. So what happens is we become fuzzy at about 6 months of age, and then all that hair just disappears. It's absorbed by the amniotic fluid. Okay, so you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Is it an adaptation? If it's an adaptation to keep us warm, we don't need it in the womb because it's always temperature regulated in there at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? It makes sense if you observe that some of our supposed relatives, like chimpanzees and gorillas, also at about the same stage in development begin developing a thick coat of hair. In their case, they don't shed it, they keep it. Okay? Because they're furry. We're known as the naked ape, but we started out, almost certainly, our ancestors were heavily furred, and we simply lost that by aborting the process of hair development at about 6 months of age in the embryo. Okay? It's an interesting thing that if you look at the obstetrics and textbooks and human embryology textbooks, they often point out this feature, but they never tell you the evolutionary significance of it. Okay? This is a retrodiction. It's something that can be understood only in light of evolution. You'd be hard-pressed to use any kind of creationist theory to explain why we have a coat of hair at 6 months of age. Okay? Vestigial organs are another retrodiction, these sort of senseless lines of history that many animals carry in their body as sort of genetic and ancestral remnants of their ancestry. I've already told you that whales evolved from animals that had 4 legs. If you look at a whale skeleton mounted in a museum, and here's one of a gray whale, you'll often see, suspended from the skeleton by 2 thin wires, a pair of vestigial or little sort of shrunken bone-like things. What are they? They don't have any function. They're not connected to the rest of the skeleton. They're just embedded in the tissue. They are, in fact, the vestigial remnants of the hind limbs that the whale used to have when it walked on 4 legs. No other explanation for it. And in fact, sometimes these things will continue to develop. Here's a hind limb, which is pretty long. You can see this is a 2-foot developed hind limb vestige from a sperm whale, and it has bones that correspond very well to the femur and the tibia. Okay? Why? Why do those bones happen to appear looking just like the leg bones of 4-footed animals at exactly the right position of the body where they should be if they were going to be hind legs? Again, only explanation that makes any sense, evolution. More vestigial organs. Here's one in the kiwi. We think from a lot of evidence that all the flightless birds, the ostrich, the rhea, the cassowary, the kiwi, all evolved from birds that had the ability to fly and had large wings. Okay? So therefore, there should be remnants, or at least one might be able to find remnants of those wings in these modern flightless birds. And sure enough, here's one in the kiwi. If you part the feathers of this bird, kiwis are very cute little nocturnal birds about this big, found in New Zealand. If you ruffle aside its feathers right there, you find, lo and behold, there's a little wing with feathers sprouting from it. These are the remnants of the wing that the kiwi had. How does it make sense? Well, if kiwis were specially created by a divine creator, why should they have vestigial wings? Makes no sense. Makes sense under the idea, which was suggested by evolutionists, that kiwis, as all ratites, or flightless birds are called, evolved from birds that had wings. Here's another prediction from the theory of evolution. That because we have vestigial organs in our body, and almost every creature does, remnants, leftover features from common ancestors, maybe we should still be carrying in our DNA the same genes that some of our ancestors had, even though they're not useful anymore. So we should be able to find, if there are features in our body that have become shrunken or aborted from our ancestors, that we should find those sort of vestigial genes as well. And indeed, and I'm just going to look at humans now for a minute, but we find plenty of them. If you look at the human genome, which we can do now because we can sequence our DNA, you find that we have hundreds of genes for odor receptors, which are genes that produce a protein that is used to detect certain odors in the air. We have hundreds of these things, but they're all non-functional. They've been rendered non-functional. You can tell a gene doesn't work because it has a big section taken out of it by natural selection, or what we call a frame shift, so the whole thing produces garbage, or there's a code, there's part of the DNA tells it to stop making a protein. But we have lots of these things still in our genome. They just don't do anything. Why are they there? Because if you look at our close relatives like mice, or or fairly close relatives, or dogs, which have much better senses of smell than we do. Those genes are there too, but in those cases, they're active. We evolved from animals like that, from nocturnal and probably not. It makes sense because we evolved from animals that had that pathway, and when we began eating fruit and got enough vitamin C in our diet, we didn't need it anymore. But we still carry the baggage. And here's what I consider the most impressive example of a dead gene in humans. This was just published a couple months ago. It comes from the observation that this is a human embryo at the age of, let me get this right, 4 weeks. So it's a fishy little thing. But what you see is that it has a yolk sac attached to it, just like a chicken. Okay, now if this was a chicken, that thing would be full of a yellowish yolk protein to nourish the embryo. Okay, in humans, we have a yolk sac too, because after all, we descended from egg-laying animals. We descended from reptiles. But the yolk sac is empty. Okay, it's just there, but it doesn't do anything. We get our nourishment through the placenta, not through the yolk sac. So we have this structure that just sort of sits there, this big empty balloon. So that's one interesting observation, which sort of suggests that we evolved from creatures with yolk. But what's more interesting is that if you sequence the human genome, and now it's been done, you find that we have genes that make that yolk protein in our bodies, exactly the same protein that chickens make and reptiles make. But in the human genome, each of those 3 yolk genes is inactivated. It's been rendered non-functional by deletions. Parts of the gene are simply missing. Okay, so why do we carry that? Why do we produce this thing in the first place? Not understandable unless you accept the proposition that we evolved from animals that had a yolk sac and made a yolk protein. Okay. Well, the last sort of general area I want to talk about retrodictions very quickly is a completely different area, but one that Darwin saw as so important that he devoted 2 chapters in his book to it, and that's the area of biogeography, which is the study of the distribution of plants and animals on the surface of the globe. Like embryology, biogeography can be used to prove evolution because there are several observations about it that are very puzzling unless you accept that evolution is true. And I can only have time to go into one. That's the observations about oceanic islands, which are these kinds of islands. This is Lord Howe Island in the South Pacific. These are oceanic islands, as were recognized by Darwin and still are today, are islands that were thrust above the surface of the ocean without any life on them. They were formed bereft of life, usually, almost always, by volcanic activity. Volcanoes that came up from below the sea. Hawaii, the Galapagos, Lord Howe, and many other oceans. Islands are oceanic islands. What Darwin observed, and this is part of his genius, not just looking at embryology and vestigial organs, but to look at biogeography, is if you look at these kind of oceanic islands and compare them with other kinds of islands that were not formed by volcanic activity, islands that were once part of continents like Great Britain or New Zealand, you see there's a lot of peculiarities. For example, a lot of these oceanic islands are missing certain forms of life, mammals, reptiles, and freshwater fish. If you look at oceanic islands throughout the world and look for endemic fish, which means found only on the island, endemic mammals, endemic reptiles, endemic amphibians, there aren't any. They're almost completely missing from these kinds of islands. But they're present on continental islands like Great Britain and some like New Zealand. So why, and they're present on continents. So why this bizarre distribution of life where major kinds of land masses are missing major kinds of life? Well, one answer that the creationists actually proposed is that those islands simply were not suitable for amphibians, mammals, reptiles, and freshwater fish. Okay? They couldn't live there. That's why God didn't put them there. Well, you can test that by introducing them to those islands, and that's happened accidentally hundreds of times over the history of human intervention. Here's 2 animals, the Indian mongoose and the cane toad, which have completely overrun Hawaii. Okay? So it's not that Hawaii isn't a suitable habitat for mammals and amphibians. It's that because they do very well when they get there. It appears to be that they didn't get there in the first place. Why? Because they have to get to an island from someplace and evolve on the island subsequently. What you do see on oceanic islands are plenty of plants, birds, and insects. Exactly those kinds of plants and animals that you would expect could colonize an island from long distances. Plants can float in the ocean, or the seeds can be ingested in bird bellies and crapped out at the other end. Birds, of course, can fly to islands and evolve there. and insects can fly or be blown by the wind. So this distribution of animals and plants is precisely what you expect under the theory of evolution. It's not comprehensible under a theory of special creation. And another closer is that those species on oceanic islands are usually most similar to species that are found on the nearest mainland. So if you look at the famous Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands, and you look throughout the world to find out, well, where are the other birds that are most similar to those finches? They're not identical, but most similar to them. They're on the west coast of South America, the closest mainland to the Galapagos. Again, this is a retrodiction, a puzzling feature of biology that can be explained only by evolution. The last kind of evidence I want to introduce is this: bad design. If animals evolved rather than being created by an intelligent creator, then we should see things that are not perfect in the way we were designed. All you have to do is slice open a mammal if you're dissecting one. Just look what a mess it is in there. Certainly not anything that a creator, at least an intelligent one, would have designed. It looks like a bunch of jury-rigged mesenteries and arteries and muscles that are a big mess. And when you start looking at those things more closely, it makes even less sense. Here's what I regard as the premier example of bad design in our species. I guess if you're a female, you would regard the childbirth mechanism as an example of bad design. But I'm a male, an aging male, so I have to consider the prostate gland, which, in effect, is a terrible piece of design because the prostate gland is an organ prone to swelling that surrounds a collapsible tube known as the urethra. That's about the worst design you can have. Put a collapsible tube that's essential for your life running through an organ that's going to swell up when you get older. Robin Williams describes this in one of his sort of least funny movies, but this is a good funny part of it. He says, well, intelligent design, how could the prostate gland be intelligent design? It's like running a sewage pipe through a recreation area, which is exactly what it is. Because as you get older, and most men experience this, you'll see this if you watch the evening news, where they sell all kinds of remedies for this problem, is that the prostate gland tends to swell up when you get about 40 or 50, closing off the flow of urine and making life very painful. Okay. Bad design. Why is it like that? Makes no sense if things were intelligently designed or created. Makes perfect sense if you look at the embryology of the prostate gland. It did, in fact, evolve from the walls of the urethra. That's why it surrounds it, because this thing is basically an evolutionary outgrowth of these tissues here. Okay. I could go into lots of other examples of bad design, but I won't. This is one that you can read about in my book, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. I won't go into it. It's this nerve that goes from our head to our larynx, but instead of going the direct route, it goes all the way down around our aorta and comes back up again. Okay. You can only understand that as a byproduct of evolution, but I won't go into that anymore. The final prediction: if evolution results largely from natural selection, we should be able to see natural selection operating in nature. Okay? Now, I've tested, and I hope convince you that common ancestry is true, gradualism is true, evolution is true, speciation is true. Now, what about natural selection? That's a little bit harder because we can see change in the fossil record, but we weren't there when it happened. So we can't, in many cases, absolutely know that it was natural selection that made such changes. But if natural selection is true, at least we should be able to see it happening around us in real time. If we didn't, we'd be in serious trouble. But lo and behold, more than 300 cases of natural selection in human times. Remember, natural selection is a very slow process. We shouldn't expect to just go out into the prairies here and be able to see something change by natural selection generation over generation. It's slow. But scientists have devoted a lot of care to this, and they've found over 300 cases of natural selection causing evolutionary change in real time. The most famous case is the evolution of the medium ground finch, Geospiza fortis, how its bill and bodies got bigger during times of drought, which is described in Jonathan Weiner's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Beak of the Finch. It's also described in my book. Let's just say there's a lot of examples of natural selection that have been found. There's no doubt that the process does occur in nature, although it's harder to document its actions in the past. Okay, so what do we have? We have evidence from the fossil record. We have evidence from vestigial organs. We have evidence from quirks of development, like the hind limbs of the spotted dolphin. We have cases of bad design, like the prostate gland, our bad backs. We have biogeographical observations, which can be explained in no way other than evolution. And we have observations of natural selection in real time. All of these different areas of biology, not just the fossil record, but all of these, giving us facts that support the idea of evolution. Not only the idea of evolution, but every part of the theory. Gradualism, evolution, common ancestry, speciation, and natural selection. Okay? What do we conclude from all of this? There's only one conclusion we can make if you're not perverse, and that's that evolution is true. Okay? And I will argue till I'm blue in the face with any of you that want to try to tell me that it's not. Because otherwise you have to find another explanation for every single one of those facts that I told you about in this lecture. So that's the formal end of the proof, but I just want to take a few minutes to talk about the problem of why this country, among all supposedly advanced Western countries and Eastern countries like Japan, is so resistant to evolution. What is unique about the United States that makes us so low on this list? 46% of us don't accept the theory of evolution. Okay? Well, what's the big difference between the United States, say, and Iceland, France, Norway, and Germany? What do we have in common with Turkey? Okay? It's probably already struck you. The answer is religion. Okay? It is entirely possible, and I'm not saying it's true, but I think it's a plausible hypothesis. Not a theory, but a hypothesis now, a speculation, that the reason the United States is that people in our country accept evolution so poorly is because we are one of the most religious countries in the world. Okay? Now we can get data on that. We can have the sort of impressionistic data. We just look at the beliefs of Americans in terms of religion. And when we do that, we find that, yes, indeed, we're one of the most religious countries on earth outside of, say, Saudi Arabia and Iran. If you look at the number of Americans that believe in the literal existence of angels, for example, 63% of us do. You may laugh, because after all, we're all liberal academics. None of us believe in angels. But if you go out on the street, 63% of Americans do. With Darwin, it's only 40%. I'm not saying we believe in Darwin's existence, but except the theory of evolution. This is pretty striking difference. 70% of Americans believe in a literal hell. Okay? So we're a very religious country. There's no doubt about that. If you take those 43 countries and you plot on one axis the proportion of people in each country, each one of these dots is one of those 34 countries. We look at each country, we look at the number of people that are religious or believe in God in those countries. We plot that on this axis, and then we plot in the same graph what percentage of those people accept evolution. We see this negative correlation here. Okay? The less you believe in Darwin, or let's say accept Darwinism or evolution, the more religious you are. Conversely, the more religious you are, the less likely you are as a country to accept evolutionary biology. And in fact, I think the trade-off is to believe 10% more in evolution, you have to give up 35% of your belief in God. Okay, and for those of you that are statisticians, the least square regression line looks like that. It's highly significant. And there we are, high in belief in God, low acceptance of evolution. This is Turkey here. Okay. Now, what is the reasons for this correlation? Well, there's two possible reasons you can say. The more religious you are, for example, the less likely you are to find evolution congenial to your belief. That's one explanation. That the causal factor is your belief in God, and then you reject evolution because of that. Or you could say it goes the other way. The more you learn about evolution, the less likely you are to believe in God, simply because learning about Darwinism makes you an atheist. Okay, I think that latter hypothesis is less likely, simply because most Americans don't know anything about evolution. So, for them to discard their religion because, or these people in this country, like Iceland, to give up their religion because they believe in evolution, I don't think that's the way it happened. I think it happened the other way around. And in fact, I have a statistic here which supports that. This just came out about 2 weeks ago. When asked, this is a poll taken of Americans, when asked what Americans would do if scientists were to disprove one of their particular religious beliefs, nearly 2/3 of people in our country say they would continue to hold what their religion teaches rather than accept the contrary scientific finding. This is a Time magazine poll published recently. So that suggests that, if science finds something else that contradicts your religious beliefs, you're just going to reject what science finds, which supports the idea that this correlation is basically driven by belief in God. Which, of course, you can see easily that if you hold to the idea that we're the special ideas of God creation, you're not going to be really welcoming in the idea that we're just evolved like squirrels or ferns or corn. That's why, in fact, that is why Darwinism is rejected. It denies us of our special purpose. It denies us of supposedly of morality. Okay. Now, I could easily say from this, okay, so I've just wasted an hour telling you about the evidence for evolution. It's not going to work. People have been doing that for 25 years in this country. I've been doing it for 20 years. And yet, still, 46% of Americans reject evolution. The real way, you could say, to make people believe in evolution is to get rid of religion. Okay? That's the efficacious way. Now, maybe that's true, but first of all, it's not going to be very easy. Second of all, it's not going to be very long. But what I want to say at the very end is that this correlation may be a bit spurious, because there was another study published, again, this is just a couple weeks ago, showing that whether you're religious is not an inherent, it's not a given thing in a given country. It's correlated with how healthy you are as a society. An article in Evolutionary Psychology came out which correlated amongst, again, a number of Western countries, and those countries are indicated by dots, what proportion of people believe in God versus what they call the successful society scale. How good you are as a society. And the successful society scale is based on a number of factors which are taken together by sociologists to indicate how secure people are in their societies, how happy they are, how healthy their societies are. It incorporates things like how much drug use there is, how much venereal disease there is, how many homicides there are, what proportion of people are in prison, is there good medical care for everybody. And as you can see, the United States is pretty low on that. Although we think of ourselves as an advanced country, if you look at the numbers and compare them to other countries, say in Europe, we're a 3 on the successful society scale compared to all these other countries. Japan, Norway, Holland, I don't know what they all stand for. Okay. But there's a negative correlation between how much you believe in God and how harmonious your society is. It's a very strong correlation. There's the least squares regression line. That is, those societies that are the most harmonious are the ones that believe in God the least. So the correlation may be somewhat different from the one I was saying before. Well, maybe Americans are more religious than other people, but maybe they're more religious for a reason. Maybe they're more religious because we live in a society that's somewhat dysfunctional, in which a number of people are insecure, and that those people become religious as a way to find security in a society in which their place is insecure. I mean, you could have the alternative opinion that, if you live in a society which is disharmonious, that tends to promote belief in, that believing in God makes your society disharmonious. You could say various right-wing things like, if you oppose abortions, you're in favor of handguns, etc. So if you believe in God, that makes your society disharmonious on purpose. I prefer to believe the other hypothesis, that people turn to religion as a way to find solace when they live in a society in which their place is insecure. So, in effect, it may be the best way to get rid of creationism and to teach evolution, or to get people to accept evolution, is not to just get rid of religion, but to do that indirectly by promoting healthier and more harmonious societies, places where every citizen feels secure and cared for. And that's not such a bad way, I think, in the end, to help people believe in evolution. In fact, it's much more important than helping people believe in evolution. And with that, I'll quit for the evening. I'll be glad to take questions.